The 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast, hosted by 360 Energy. Bob Hawkesworth describes himself as a recovering politician. He served for 23 years as a member of Calgary City Council and for 2 terms as a member of the Alberta Legislature. Since leaving elected politics in 2010, he has worked on housing, climate, energy, and environment issues. As a consultant, Bob has helped companies and nonprofit groups with strategic planning, communications, and community engagement. He has worked in the Alberta Premier's office. Bob also finds time to volunteer on the boards for 2 charities and for Bow Valley College in Calgary. Bob's overriding passion is trying to reduce the risks of a hotter climate. Now let's get into the episode with Bob. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Welcome back. It's good to be back. Thank you, Dave.
And John, we missed you. And Lysandra and I both agreed next time you're going on vacation, we'll go with you and do the podcast live. Then that's what you really don't have a choice to answer, respond to that, but that's what we've decided, right, Lysandra?
Yes.
That would be cool. I'm not sure what my family and friends would have said about that if you joined me on vacation, but there you go.
Today we're joined by Bob Hawkesworth. Welcome, Bob.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, no, I was going to say, Lysandra, I'm excited to have Mr. Hawkesworth with us. Bob, I think you'll find in his conversation, he's not only passionate about this whole subject matter, but he has lived in this space for many years and has been very successful at implementing things in the environmental field in Alberta, which that might sound kind of foreign to some of our listeners, but he's got a wealth of knowledge and experience in dealing in this area. So I think people are going to gain a lot of knowledge by listening to Bob's, some of his comments and his experience as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dave.
Thank you.
John, I'll pass it to you to start off our episode today.
Okay, today we're talking about government and climate, and we often hear in many jurisdictions people talking about, oh, we're declaring a climate emergency. But what does it mean when a jurisdiction declares a climate emergency?
Yes, well, let me talk about my own personal experience here in Calgary. Our new council was elected about a year and a half ago, and the first thing the new mayor did with her council was declare a climate emergency. And I didn't see or hear much said about that on the campaign trail. It was a little bit of a surprise for them to do that, but it seemed to be a flag in the ground that this council had a particular set of priorities and they wanted to address this issue. So I think when you declare an emergency, it means you acknowledge or you're recognizing that some harm is going on that's significant enough that warrants drop everything you're doing and focus on it. So I think that is largely signaling something as a set of priorities. Many jurisdictions have done it, so it might be a Me Too kind of response that we get it, we want to do something about this. This House of Commons here in Canada a couple of years ago declared a climate emergency. And somebody could be a bit cynical about all of this and say, well, that's where it starts and that's where it ends. But I think my sense of it is it's an important signal. It's a way politicians can sort of draw public attention to an issue as a way of trying to rally support or prepare people that some changes may be on their way to try and address this significant issue. How successful it is, I think, is maybe we'll explore that in our conversation this morning, because we have an emergency department in the hospitals. People show up and there are whole sorts of protocols. We have emergency medical services, which is the ambulance system. And when you call, there are certain standards that they'll be there within a certain few minutes. And so on. Those standards and protocols are being built. They're not in place. So you see a declaring a climate emergency, and then nothing happens. And so what was that all about? Was it an emergency or wasn't it? I think basically they're done by public authorities and they have a certain resonance, but there's a lot of difficulty in actually implementing them. Let me give you a couple of other examples though. These are the familiar ones, but the owner of Patagonia Sportswear about 18 months ago said, I'm turning over this company to Mother Nature. The climate or the environmental crisis or emergency is so great. All the profits from this company and our sales will go to a charitable trust to fight climate change. Wow. So there's an individual, an owner, private owner, a billionaire owner of a private company on his own declaring a climate emergency and then took commensurate action, which really was a rapid response. And I would say you guys, you folks, have also in some way declared a climate emergency in the priorities you make in your own life. So for myself, I think I can even recall kind of the aha moment. I was attending a Federation of Canadian Municipalities conference in Regina in 1998. I went to a workshop on climate change. I just sort of wandered in as a delegate at this conference. And this presentation blew me away. I had no idea the consequences, the harm, the risks, the potential damage of climate change. I said, this is something that is calling me. It needs my attention. I need to, and I made a personal commitment that I would do something every single day to do what I could in whatever way I could to help solve this problem. So in a way, for myself, I declared there's a climate emergency here, so this requires my attention and my emergency response. Although back in 1998, nobody was talking about a climate emergency.
I come back with a bit more on this because I'll be careful with this because we stray into slight areas with this podcast. But I'm going to put it on a UK basis, and then you can decide to answer this on a Canadian US basis. But in this country, I would say, I can't give you the statistics, but anecdotally, I would say a local authority, a municipality, or whatever is more likely to declare a climate emergency if it is a centre or left of centre party in control. Any comments?
Yes, yeah. This is no, well, this is a huge conundrum because climate is a physics problem. This is a problem of how carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere are reacting to retain the heat from the Earth, keeping it from radiating into space. How did that physical properties of the universe become a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue?
Non-issue.
No, it's that, and there's something about this issue, and maybe we'll dig in a little deeper, but part of it is how few people really could describe to you what climate change is. I
Yeah.
doubt if there was one person in 10, if you just saw them on the street, would you explain climate change to me? Would one person in 10 be able to tell you what was going on, how it was actually working? And so how we break through that is the big question mark in my mind.
Education, isn't it?
It's partly education, it's language, it's framing. The problem of climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. And every person in the world now is dependent to some extent on the burning of fossil fuels, either to get food or work related or transportation, or in some way or another, our entire system is founded on the burning of fossil fuels, which the byproduct is carbon dioxide. And it's this. So we're all jointly, collectively, individually, together responsible for the problem. And you have to maybe have some understanding or sense of the need for a collective action, which is because it's a kind of this common good collective problem that needs collective action to solve, which tends to be a left of center point of view. And yet, on the other hand, there's a market around climate and fossil fuels, and you want to transform a market. How do you do that? And so now there are obviously thinkers in the right wing of the spectrum who are doing tremendous amount of work on this. How do you engage those with a kind of a right-wing perspective and then put these two together? At the time I was in political life, social media was not really a factor. I left just as that was emerging. And we have another problem around how social media is polarizing us into various camps. People figure out how to monetize this, so there's lots of money being made by doing this. So where you need putting the left wing and the right wing together to solve this existential issue, the pressures are such that it's driving people away. And this is why I'm just so grateful for 360 Energy and the work you're doing and your leadership, David, you and John. Is you are one of the examples in my life that gives me hope, that is trying to put these two perspectives together.
Well, Bob, and coming back to what John's saying, not to go off on a different tangent, but I will. And what you're saying, I actually believe, and we've conveyed this many times, that if there's proper management techniques within an organization, if they actually tracked and measured the impact that climate change has had on them and is having on them, they might change their tune pretty quickly. So this week, for some reason, because I'm hearing this, like most organizations, okay, insurance costs have increased. Okay. Now, we know this, but not many people in organizations know this because they work in silos, so that information is not shared.
Right.
There's supply disruptions that occur, so you don't get the product in time because there's, a flood in BC, or there's problems in the East Coast, Nova Scotia. So there's a supply interruption. So that impacts your production. There's are now demanding that you provide certain content or emission reductions. So you have an opportunity of maybe losing business because you don't have that capability. So you may not get the incremental business or retain the business. So that's not tracked because that's in the sales department. That works in a little silo over here. And then you have utility costs. I didn't know this, but utilities are self-insured. So what happens is, for example, in the East Coast, their costs are going up by 14% because there was so much damage. They have to get that incremental cost back. It's 14%. Utility costs are going up. Again, most customers don't even know utility costs, right? So that's increasing. And then you have employees that want to work for a company that's really forward thinking and that's looking at this. And that's not tracked or really considered internally within organizations. What I'm saying to you, there's a business perspective and a cost that currently is not being captured and reported and understood throughout the whole organization. I think if it was, and it will be, things are going to change. I want to say the business perspective will move things quicker because they'll have to, because they're realizing the price signals, they're not getting the price signals. So I do think it's going to change rapidly, and it has to change, because if you don't, and we've conveyed this many times, we think there's some particular challenges. So anyhow, going off on a tangent, that's kind of where I want to go.
Well, this is more conversation than anything, and I appreciate that. I really concur very much with what you're saying, is that the cost of inaction now is starting to be understood as being at least as great as, if not greater, than the cost of actually starting to make the changes and the shifts. And it's only going to become, unfortunately, maybe the damage is going to be significant before it penetrates, which I hope not. But to your point, David, that there is not the protocols in place. There are not the protocols in place after you declare a climate emergency. And I think governments are out there, city halls around the world who've done this are trying to figure out, okay, now that we've declared it, then what? And as you say, well, actually, how many of you are really doing a good job of actually understanding what your profile is, your energy use, where, when, how, and not just that, but how much is that costing? Putting your use together with your cost is a fairly sophisticated. I mean, your company's been doing it for 25 years, but not very many people have been doing it for 25 days. So they aren't doing it. So that's number one. And then how do you put together a protocol that takes up your whole organization? Because emergencies, well, we've got a fire department who responds to fires. We've got a hospital ward that's an emergency ward. We kind of silo these emergency responses when what you're saying, well, you kind of got to put your whole organization on the line here and start doing things in terms of communication and broadly engaging people, and then measure and report. And if along with declaring a climate emergency, oh, here's the manual, now here's how you organize your city hall to get this done, that would be the next step. I think people are trying to invent the wheel in city halls all across the world now because of these declarations, when in fact, many ways you've developed the playbook.
So, Bob, as you've indicated, a variety of people need to be involved. Certainly, we've conveyed and suggest that, from government to businesses and government at all levels. Why I'm really pleased having you here is that you have worked in multiple structures. So from provincial legislation to municipal legislation to even associations trying to convey this. So you have this wealth of knowledge and experience of what it takes on this topic matter. So my question to you, based on your experience, who needs to approve a climate emergency within government?
Well, really good, very good question. And I'm wondering, I understand the language around a climate emergency. It's essential, but sometimes this really is a whole change management process. It's a foundational, you're trying to change cultures. You have to change cultures, and you're actually changing organizational processes. So how do you do change management? You also have to paint a compelling picture of your desired end state. What comes to my mind, several years ago, I think it was Gregor Robertson was the mayor of Vancouver. He was going to make Vancouver the greenest city in the world's greenest city. And there's something about that language that's maybe empowering, hopeful. There's something that's a little different motivation to do something the best than a motivation to respond to loss of life, loss of property, loss of. I don't know whether declaring a climate emergency quite does it, the language of all of this. So who do you have to have involved? I think you have to have somebody who is in a process that can drive change in an organization. And if your chief administrative officer or your CEO does not get this, the change is not going to happen. In a private company, the owner, so the Patagonia owner, for example, can say, hey, this company's going to go to Mother Nature. He can make that decision. And Bill Gates, who runs the Gates Foundation, can say, oh, I'm putting so many billions of my foundation to work on this issue. He can do that. Those are examples of the people who are at the top making change happen. So if your city manager doesn't have the job or your CEO doesn't have the job, it won't get done. If you give it to your energy manager or your sustainability manager, what that is signaling is this is not a change management process. This is a task among many tasks. For me, I think the climate is the strategy of all strategies, or that's kind of the change management plan of all plans, because if we don't get on top of it, it's going to drive us. You need everybody at the top to help lead this and set out the action steps and assign the responsibilities, paint the end goal and the desired, why that's a desired end goal, and move the needle. Does that help? What's your experience? Is that similar to what you've experienced?
Yes, like for sure, probably our listeners are tired of us saying how senior management has to be involved and bought in and engaged. But we've also found, Bob, if people below them don't have a position or are passionate about the position,
Yeah.
it can fail too. Like it won't even start. It won't even get out of the gate. So there, I think your point of making it a vision and being very clear, and people within the organization understand the vision and the value to them. I think that's important. But I've seen on the other side where senior management has done that or executives have stated it, and then it just failed because they had the inappropriate people to drive this thing.
Well, that's right. And with any change management process, you kind of have to have it fairly well mapped out to not down to the details, but you need to be thinking about how you bring your managers on board and what are the incentives and disincentives. There's, as we've talked about already, a lot of education, but out there in society is a lot of pushback. There are people whose livelihoods feel threatened, whose industry feels threatened by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. And there are efforts to stem this change, to maintain our dependence on fossil fuel use. And so there's a lot of misinformation. People in their off hours go on the internet and see all kinds of things being said. So it complicates it. This is where I think the language is important and helping to address the climate risks, but it's also to make the world safer, to make our company more resilient, to make our company thrive and prosper beyond the next 5 years, well into the future. It's about how is it that our company not only is it profitable, but its social mission in terms of the products we produce. How is it making life better for our customers and our society? And with that as our purpose and our mission, how does these changes go beyond our organization? These are the kinds of messages in a change management process where you're trying to bring your people on board to show them multiple benefits. Not only does it help climate, but it does this for you and our kids. So it's a whole communication program. And I don't know that when I talk to climate communicators, they're thinking about populations of how we get constituencies large enough to make the politicians and decision makers sit up and take notice. But I haven't really talked with anybody in a corporate setting responsible for corporate level communications about what is the change management process that you communicate internally around climate action and taking the communications. What about the plant managers? What about the sales and marketing team? What about the service people and the repairs and that, whatever the organization is, every single one, how are they able to see that these changes are going to be beneficial to them and to this company? I don't know that we've really got a playbook quite yet for that process.
We're working on it, Bob, just so I give you a heads up on that one.
Okay, I know.
Over to you, John.
So we've declared a climate emergency. We know we've got approval for it. We need to do something else that's not necessarily moving the dial. So the next thing we do is we say we're going to have a climate strategy. What is a climate strategy? Particularly looking in terms of government, municipality, and a civic response.
Right, right. Well, as I say, climate strategy should be the strategy of all strategies in the sense, because sometimes there's a corporate strategy for sales, for growth. I know for cities, every silo has a strategy. There's a water use strategy, a stormwater management strategy, a parks and land acquisition strategy. There's strategy after strategy. Strategy describes an end state from 5 to 10 years out. In the case of climate, the attempts are really longer term than that because the impact of climate is, of course, into the thousands of years into the future. So the decisions we make today are going to have incredibly long-term ramifications if we don't get this right, or even if we do get it right, we'll avoid a problem of long-standing. And so from an international perspective, there's, again, because it's physics, you can measure it. Parts per million of gases in the atmosphere, degrees centigrade, average temperature rise. All these things have been quantified to the point that in order to keep global average temperatures from rising no more than 2 degrees centigrade, we must stop adding carbon to the atmosphere by 2050 at the outside. That gives us 2 chances out of 3 of avoiding that problem. And so there's kind of an international target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. These are scientifically founded, evidence-based climate science. These are the numbers because it's physics. It's not arbitrary. And so a climate strategy has to align with the science, first of all. And so these targets are being adopted. Canada's adopted them by 2030 in order to get to net zero by 2050. Canada's carbon emissions have to drop 45% from 2005 levels in the next 7 years. Well, we don't know what were our 2005. When was that? What was that? How many were that? There's a problem there, not knowing what your baseline is and not knowing how far you have to go in the time period that has been chosen. So again, these strategies have targets. How realistic are they? And then once you've adopted them, what are you going to do to meet them? Is it just checking a box and business as usual? So there's some hard numbers in there. And believe me, as we can see when we look at a case study, the emissions have to drop off a cliff. No one knows yet really quite how this is going to be done. So a climate strategy really has to get up out of the family of strategies that an organization might have. And if it's going to be a corporate strategy, how does it drive sales? How does it drive revenue growth? How does it drive operations? These are huge, huge questions and the difficult ones to answer. So we have to have some sympathy for those who take this on, that it may not appear that much is happening on the surface, but behind the scenes, these are huge questions that are being grappled with, and we're not making rapid progress. That's what a climate strategy has to do, is drive everything else. It has to become the lens around which all other decisions are viewed.
That's interesting. I was going to say that's interesting there, but can I just throw another little tangent in? You talked about the time frame. You've talked of 2030. You've talked of 2050. You've talked of 1,000 years on.
Yes.
Political time frames are typically around 4 years because you're looking at the next election. So that becomes a problem, doesn't it? Squaring this issue of trying to get back into power in 4 years' time whilst making what might be tough decisions to secure our future. So what's your view on that?
I understand it completely. I really do. I, I, and that's, I don't think anybody wants to live where, the top brass can dictate the next 5-year plan. We're going to do this. And China's making some very rapid changes in our democratic governance. We really value and treasure the ability of people to be engaged and involved in making their own choices. So there's a much different and maybe even a more difficult process for change management. But I also believe that once that happens, it's more enduring. And all of these issues are being contested. So it's so important for us to have cases of where people have done it, what have they learned, and what have been the benefits. Part of what's holding us back is the comfortable status quo. We understand that. And so there's an inertia. Again, there's a compelling case for change. And if we can see that, why can't our city do the same? Or how did they save all that water in Regina? What can we learn about that here in Windsor, Ontario? Or this is where we have to give strength and confidence for those who want to make change. The one ingredient that cannot be missed is having a champion. If there is no champion, and especially somebody in a decision-making role, this isn't going to happen in any organization, no matter how many strategies they approve. I'd like to think that the changes I was able to accomplish with my colleagues on city council when I was there in Calgary, and our mayor, Dave Bronkanye, was a wonderful ally in helping, but we needed 8 votes. So he supported his champion, Bob, when these things came forward, and we were able to get a lot of things done because we had a group on council who could make things happen, but wouldn't have happened, I don't think, without at least one champion. And so in Calgary, I'm trying to find out who's our champion, even now that the climate emergency's been declared. Or in Vancouver, who's the champion for the greenest city in the world. And in your customer companies, David, are the owners on side? Are the CEOs on side? Who's the champion in the organization that's really can move the dial with all their colleagues? I think you'd agree that those companies where you've had the greatest success are where those champions show up, because in their heart of hearts, they've declared this is an emergency and I'm going to do what I can in my role in this place to help make change happen.
You're so right. And so, I mean, you've talked about who's responsible and involved in implementing a climate strategy. Like when you look at your government experience and exposure, whether it's provincial or municipal, maybe it'd be best like talk about municipal. Who do you think, you've talked about a champion, but is there other departments or people that need to be involved in implementing this climate strategy? If you could just share with our listeners, your experience, who are critical pieces of this.
I think the city manager has to be on board. And I think whomever that person sets up as their team to lead the change management process in the corporation has to be in the city manager's office. I think the city council has to explicitly turn this issue over to the city manager. Do not allow the city manager to delegate it to even one level below his or her office. And I think more importantly, even than that, perhaps city council has to give one of its committees a mandate, a climate committee or climate review or corporate strategy initiatives committee or something. Somebody has to have monthly meetings with the city manager about how are we doing? How are our measures being implemented? What's our work plan? What's coming up to council over the next 6 months that need approval? This is where this has to reside. Cities have not organized themselves to implement their climate strategies. And that is what they have to do. It's not quite the same remuneration structure as you get in the private sector, where KPIs, there are year-end incentive payments for performance that are offered to those for meeting, growth goals, revenue, profitability targets, all that. Carbon emissions should be included. For a board should require carbon emission success as part of the compensation for their CEO and for the board remuneration as well. I don't know whether that's even being done, but in the public sector at the municipal level, somehow there has to be part of the CEO, city manager evaluation is how did we do in implementing our climate strategy. It should be part of their annual assessment.
Follow up on that. So internally, and I understand the positioning, what you've said, the manager who needs to be involved. Is it helpful to actually also make that information transparent, not only internally within the city and their employees, but it is also helpful to start sharing that information to the public so the public can see what the city is actually undertaking? It reinforces if the city can do it, then, heck, why can't we do it? How often is that done with local municipal governments?
Well, this is a problem as well. Not just everywhere is greenwashing. Look at us. Look at our success at being environmentally sustainable, and they'll roll out some measure or another and say pat ourselves on the back. But when you look at what that measure actually achieves, it may not really be doing anything, which is why these measures are so important and really need to be understood. That the reason we are asking you or promoting public transit, for example, is because every time a passenger gets on a bus, instead of in their car, it has this kind of a climate benefit. And so therefore, one of the measures we're tracking at City Hall should be something along the lines of how many millions of passengers boarded our buses and our transit system this last year. And is that going up? And is it the ridership rising quickly enough to meet our climate strategy goals? Again, this comes back to the communication, is having the right measures, helping people understand here's the international target. And if you follow that to our climate strategy, and then these 3 or 4 or 5 priorities in our climate strategy, here are the key measures. And by taking this measure and doing this action, you actually are supporting this international target of climate emission reductions. That alignment of measures, actions, strategy, and international targets has not been done, to my knowledge, anywhere. And I think that's a foundational piece, is that if you're not measuring your progress, you have no idea how well you're doing.
Thanks for that, Bob. On that note, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners from this episode?
How hard this is, I will say, I somewhere along the line, early on, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I just decided this is probably going to be the most important work I ever do, but it's probably going to be the hardest. And I just, over my career, decided that the harder the work, the greater the satisfaction. If you give yourself small challenges, but if you take on the most important challenge facing humankind, as hard as it is, any progress feels good, and even making the effort feels good.
Thanks for that, Bob. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
I thought there was so much that some heavy stuff that Bob was bringing in. But one thing that captured my attention is because we hear about sustainability managers all the time or departments. And this work tends to be sent their way. And as Bob said, that's a task. It's not a strategy of all strategies. And my experience, and I hope I don't offend any of our listeners, sometimes these sustainability folks don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the support to actually make it happen. And so I think Bob kind of nailed it. This actually has to be a strategy within strategies, and they need to have senior management involvement, ongoing support. You can't just dump it to a department and go, okay, you're done, which is traditional in I think the business. That was something that caught my attention that Bob said.
Thanks, Dave. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
Again, there's a whole raft of things here. It's always interesting being the last one to say the takeaway because you put something down and then someone goes, "Oh, that's gone,
Mhm.
that's gone." I don't mean this the wrong way, but please don't take it the way. But talking about we've got not everybody on the same page, we need more Bobs. If we had more people that felt and acted like Bob, we certainly would get the dial moving.
Thank you.
Thanks for
How do
that.
we do that?
We're
Maybe your
cloning you,
listeners.
Bob.
No pressure, no pressure.
Bob, we're gonna go. They're gonna have some Bob iBots now. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for another great episode, Bob, Dave, and John. Talk to you next week.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye for now.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.